Hello everyone, welcome back to this next video. As you can tell from the title, today I'll be talking about Japanese tanks in the Second World War and why I think they're not quite as bad as most people seem to believe. So Japanese tanks in World War II are generally considered a bit of a joke. With small caliber guns, light armour and low crew numbers, there are very few notable vehicles or even successful ones. Their tanks mostly date from the 1930s, being equivalent to vehicles like the T-26 or the Panzers I and II. Whilst these tanks mounted a pathetic defence against the onslaught of Shermans, M3s and T-34s at the end of the war, what is often not realised is how successful they were earlier in their service lives. While most would say World War II broke out on the 1st of September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, the war in the Far East had already been going on for years. With the Japanese invasion of large areas of China and Korea came large numbers of the Type 95 Hago and later Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks. These are the most widespread Japanese tanks of the war, and when introduced in 1935 and 1937 respectively, were considered very capable vehicles for what they were used for. More of that in a bit. The Type 95 Hago was the most widespread type of Japanese tank throughout the war, with over 2,000 produced in total. It mounted a 37mm gun, a decent weapon at its inception, but only featured around 12mm of armour intended to counter 7.7mm armour-piercing machine gun rounds. Its main strength, however, was its speed. A key part of its design was the ability to travel at 25 miles per hour on roads, and it could reach that and 18 miles per hour cross-country. Good for the time and comparable to the later American Stuart tanks. The next most common vehicle was the Type 97 Chi-Ha, a larger vehicle initially with a 57mm low-velocity gun, good for firing high explosive shells, in a similar principle to the gun first fitted to the Panzer IVs, but it was later upgraded to a higher velocity 47mm anti-tank gun when it came up against the Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks. The BTs had more powerful guns and much better armour than the Hago, but it was slightly slower overall. And now onto why I think these tanks get too much flack for being bad tanks. The first and foremost reason is their complete incapability to counter the 1940s era Allied tanks later in the war, such as the Shermans and the T-34s that I mentioned earlier. I personally think this is unfair because they were designed in a completely different era with different requirements in mind. The Japanese tanks were mostly used against Chinese peasants, with their most modern vehicles being Vickers Mark E's and some German Panzer I's, which were completely inferior to the comparatively modern Japanese tanks. Later in the war, against the thick armour and massive guns of the later Allied tanks, the tables were turned against the Japanese. Some may argue with this, stating that the Japanese should have built more, better tanks with larger guns and better armour, and there are two answers to this. The first is that they couldn't, as there are a few things about Japan in World War II that must be known before a discussion like this. The first is that Japan is an island nation, like the UK, and therefore has a focus on their navy. The tank development programmes were constantly plagued by issues with supplies, such as steel for a quality good enough to make armour plate, as that was always prioritised for the Navy, and hence the Army never received enough to make all the tanks that they wanted. Secondly, the latter half of World War II for the Japanese was mostly fought across small Pacific islands, obviously with no way to make their own tanks there, so instead they all had to be shipped over. Large vehicles would have been incredibly difficult to get to these islands with no large docks or major infrastructure, so the smaller vehicles were a lot easier to move off boats and onto the islands. The second answer is that they did, in fact, have better vehicles available. The Chai-Hi, Chai-Nu and Chai-To were all based on derivations of the Chai-Ha hull, but with much more powerful guns, such as high-velocity 75mm guns able to slice through the frontal armour of a Sherman. The few that were built, however, were all either not fully developed in time, such as the Chi-To, or in the case of the Chi-Nu, all retained for the defence of the homeland from the expected Soviet and American invasions. Whilst these vehicles could possibly have been effective, they were hampered by issues outside of their own control, and we never got to see their potential. So I hope now that you have an appreciation for some of the Japanese tanks and that you see them in a bit of a different light. I want to make this video because Japanese tanks, at least to me, are a very interesting story and one that I feel doesn't get enough attention. Anyway, that's all for now. If you have anything to add, then don't hesitate to leave a comment below and I'll be sure to reply to it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.